Hello, everyone. My name is David Koenig. I'm the founder of the Directors and Chief Risk Officers Group, and I'm glad that you're able to join us today. We're going to be talking with Roel Campos and David Martin, who co-chaired one of our governance councils on cybersecurity. And we'll get started with that in just a second. I wanted to give you a quick overview of the Directors and Chief Risk Officers Group. We're an international organization. We are a collaborative effort where people are giving of their time freely to help advance the practices of risk governance. And that cuts across a number of areas, including cybersecurity, but we've done work in the areas of compensation risk, defining qualified risk directors for boards. We're working on risk committees and innovation governance, and you'll see reports from the DCRO later this year on that. Today, though, we're focused on the initiative around cybersecurity. And as I mentioned, Roel and David were the co-chairs of a committee that featured nearly 30 people from 5 continents who all contributed their expertise. So let me briefly introduce David and Roel. Roel Campos is a partner with the law firm of Hughes Hubbard Reed in Washington, D.C. He's chair of the Securities Enforcement Practice and is a former commissioner of the SEC. David Martin is a cybersecurity expert who serves as the managing partner of Cybex Secure, and he's a former chief risk officer of Alliance Bernstein, and they both have bios that are much longer than this with lots of things that they've done in this space and other spaces. You can find those in the document that we're going to be talking about today. So let me welcome David and Roel. Glad to have you both with us.
Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So today we want to run this like an interview, and I wanted to talk to you about these principles, the DCRO guiding principles on cybersecurity and cyber risk management for boards of directors. What was the motivation behind this initiative, and how did you guys get involved? Because this is a pretty big time commitment of yours.
Well, I don't know. I start. I was actually co-chaired a group called the Buy-Side Risk Managers Forum that had the chief risk officers of the 25 largest asset managers of the world. And in 2008, I sat around the table and said, guys, if we don't create risk principles, other people will, and we should do them because we're the most knowledgeable to do them. So that sort of gave me the perspective of this was something that was really important. And looking at cybersecurity, I thought it was absolutely essential, and it just made absolute sense to me to go ahead and get involved in this effort.
Well, I started being interested in cybersecurity because it became such a exposure and liability to public companies and their boards, and so I started looking into it as a practice matter. To serve my clients and those who I advise. It turns out that David and I had collaborated. David had been one of my expert witnesses in a proceeding that we held, and we've got to know each other very well. And I came to realize what a great fountain of expertise David was in terms of enterprise risk and the different areas. So we decided to work together on promoting the area, and we wrote an article prior to the one that we are dealing with here today on cyber risk, and did a primer for boards in managing cyber risk. And so along the way, David Koenig became acquainted with us, and we were very happy and anxious to provide some service to the committee and to put together what we thought collectively from all of the expertise involved with the group to put together these particular principles, and it's been a great joy to do so.
Well, and it sounds like both of you saw a motivation for this, either in stories or experiences. Are there any that you can relate to us from your clients, or maybe not necessarily directly from your clients, but from other experiences you've heard about, positive and negative in this space?
Well, I can just tell you my first experience in this space was actually 25 years ago. I was the enterprise risk manager for Citicorp, and I had read this book called Takedown. And they've actually made a movie out of it, but Tatsumu Shimamura, who is a professor at MIT, actually being hacked by Kevin Mitnick, who subsequently went to jail and now has a cybersecurity consulting practice. But I actually hired Shimamura to come in and hack Citicorp. So my involvement with cybersecurity goes back, almost 25 years at this point.
Well, I don't go back that far, but not that I'm, much younger than David. I'm not. But I was in blissful ignorance, while David was in knowledgeable pursuits. No, essentially, from my perspective, it just became an obvious area that boards and other clients were concerned about. And then when recent episodes occurred, like we've all read about Equifax and Uber, and the depth of problems that those particular instances created, for the board, for disclosures, concerns on the part of the SEC, as to whether certain disclosures regarding hacking should be made earlier, insider trading, all of those things just led me to this area, which fraught with peril, essentially.
Well, and the level of interest in the publication has been extremely high. I think of all the ones that we've published right now through the DCRO, this one has got the most attention, and so that must be a suggestion that there's an issue that a lot of people recognize. Are there good metrics out there? So let's say a company is thinking this isn't that big a deal for them, or it's not going to affect them. Do you guys have any metrics that you've seen about the size and scale, or even the growth rate of cybersecurity issues and their impact?
Well, everything that I've looked at, it's basically the growth has been exponential. It's interesting. One of the most important things is probably the cyber spend, which has been growing at double-digit rates for the last 10 years. So I just see this getting bigger. I also see, and Roel knows more about this than I do, but at first it was credit cards, just cut off the liability with credit cards. Then it was now medical records, and medical records are hard to control because you have the hospital, the doctor, the insurer, and the patient, and you're getting into ransom. But eventually it'll be very widespread, even more, and trade secrets. It just goes on and on. So I just see this thing getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and to me, if we're looking for metrics, David, it's there's no given index that'll tell you there's a problem or not. I think you begin with an assessment, as we discuss in our principles, as to whether there are vulnerable and vulnerable assets that need to be protected. I suppose you could be a company that keeps very little in the way of personal information, sensitive information about customers. It could happen, but most companies today are not in that scenario and in that situation. Excuse me. I look at how often a board discusses cybersecurity, as an important measure of whether that company is perhaps doing enough. If it's something that gets talked to occasionally, once a year or once every other year, I'd be worried about that company. This is a situation in which management has to be actively involved, has to be actively reporting to the board, has to be keeping abreast of the problems. As David mentioned, cyber risks and hacking abilities are increasing every day, and a company that may think they're very safe may not be, as things have evolved and developed.
And I think that's a good way for us to jump into these principles, because we've got 5 key principles that we want to talk about or have you talk about. And just getting back quickly to that notion of metrics, in reading about this, it seemed as if they were dueling efforts to make this number bigger. But the numbers that I saw in articles were in the trillions in their impact. And then there's also the caveat that some companies don't have incentive to report accurate impact, because that it potentially makes them look bad if they're not being transparent, or if they're being transparent, I should say, about the impact of some of this, especially as it gains more attention. So let me jump into this first guiding principle. Let's see if I can get that screen to show up. Okay, you had talked, I think, without using the expression, though, when you started talking about customer data, and David, you had mentioned health records, you guys used this expression crown jewels in terms of something a board should be aware of. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and then go through this notion of how directors should be viewing this as part of enterprise risk?
Yeah, let me take a step back on this. When I look at errors, I think of things in terms of errors of commission and errors of omission. An error of commission, you looked at it, you went the wrong way. An error of omission, you didn't even look at it. I can live with errors of commission. I just can't live with errors of omission. So if you take that philosophical bent and apply it to cybersecurity, at the end of the day, what is it that you're trying to protect? And then are you developing appropriate strategies against that? Because it's not if you're going to get attacked, but when, and you can only guarantee a timely and appropriate action. So the way I think about it, and Roel, I talked about it with the committee, it's really what are the crown jewels? What are the most important things that you're trying to protect? How are you going to mitigate, the risk? And, what are your specific plans associated with each?
And David, is that being done at risk committees, or where do you see that being done? Is it board as a whole conversation?
First the first question is it being done?
Okay.
Are people having these kinds of discussions? And then at the board, and then we're at the board. I would say that my experience consulting with major firms on this, people are getting boards are getting better at it, and the CTOs and CISOs are getting better at identifying what the crown jewels are. But there's still somewhat of a disconnect. For example, how many people compare the specific assets that you're trying to protect, the most important ones, and then compare that to the budget that you're spending, saying, hey, we're allocating this budget based on the most important assets that we're trying to protect. So, it's one thing to identify, but then, okay, now that you've identified, how are you approaching it in a rational way?
And Roel, if you were a company that is looking at these issues, where do you start? I mean, part of this first guiding principle is to develop specific plans associated with each approach. Let's say they haven't even gotten started on this; they're just now recognizing it as a board issue. Where would you tell them to start?
Well, first you have to recognize that cyber security is part of the overall enterprise risk matrix, right? So hopefully most companies have some approach to mitigating risk, right? You're aware that weather disasters can occur. You're aware that there might be an interruption of some type of essential services, utilities. You might lose power, therefore having backup. All of that hopefully is something that is in the in the consciousness of most management teams and companies. So from there you go to cybersecurity. I would think would be a logical place if you don't already have it. And I think what you need to have the senior management team very aware and have an approach through their their IT, through their intellectual property. If they don't have a CISO, they certainly have some sort of a risk officer, and you would ask for a set of approaches and plans to be prepared, and then you would enter into this first principle. What are the crown jewels? What are the assets that are vulnerable that would cause huge disruptions and potentially create huge liabilities for the company? Once you have your arms around that, with your people in the management team, then you have to involve your board and then set up a board process where the board oversees what management is doing, sets up accountability, sets up a reporting situation. So we can get into a lot of details here, but essentially, I think it begins with senior management, and if senior management isn't doing it, then one of the leaders of the board, the chair, or another lead director, needs to engage management and begin the process, and to integrate cybersecurity and the approach within the enterprise risk function.
Well, and I think that gives us a great way to kind of cross this IT board or managerial board line, in that boards often are saying, well, if it's a strategic issue, it's ours, but if it's a technical issue, it belongs in IT, or it belongs somewhere in the managerial space. But the second guiding principle that came out of your work with the council seems to suggest that we have to be viewing cybersecurity as both strategic and managerial. So can you talk a little bit about what that change of mindset is? There are 5 other bullets that came along with this, along the notion of this being strategic. But what's the main gist there? How do you get a board to see this as a strategic issue? Is it just through example of brand damage, or what's the best way for them to understand?
It's interesting when you say that. It goes back to my, I guess, early days at Citicorp. And Walter Wriston, the CEO, used to say there's nothing wrong with risk as long as it's managed. Now, that maybe have come a little bit further these days to there's nothing wrong with risk as long as you get paid for it. But in a sense here, what we're really talking about is with cybersecurity, look, this is not a technical issue. It's a managerial issue, and you need to manage it. And you need to have all the things that relate to good management, accountability, attestation if you need it, awareness and training, some testing, and, how do you deal with a crisis? Because you're going to have to deal with it at some point, so you might as well get ready for it beforehand. So I see this more in terms of leadership. And I also, just as an aside, think that companies have to have, and I think, Roel, you coined this term, a cyber lens. You have to see things through a cyber lens. You have to understand that there's a balance between innovation and risk. You have to think about it from an HR perspective in terms of the people that you employ and the training that you give them, because this is an issue that's going to be with us for a long time, and we need to manage it.
I think that the concept of strategy exclusively being on the side of the board and managerial being on the side of the management team is no longer so sharp. Essentially, a board, just like a board, for example, oversees a lot of very technical managerial items. So ultimately, the board has to make sure that proper financial statements are prepared that report accurately and with integrity, the results of the company's performance, right, financially. Here, they have this is the board now. They have a duty to investors. Fiduciary duties to make sure that valuable assets on the part of the company are protected. Therefore, they're protecting the value, the overall value, capitalization of the company. So when they go past that line and hold management accountable, that's entirely appropriate. What is management doing to protect valuable assets, or the most valuable assets? And cyber is a way that they're exposed. You think of it metaphorically as a window that's open, right? What are we doing to close that window as much as possible and keep the blizzard out? Just to extend that metaphor. So this is very appropriate, and boards are more and more having to cross that line. Cyber is just one of the latest areas, but it'll happen again as other threats to the enterprise and to assets arise. So this is exactly what we were trying to reach in this second principle. Yes, delegate. Management needs to bring in the technical expertise, including going outside and getting expertise when appropriate. but they need to be accountable to the board. They need to report. They need to attest at times, and they need to worry. You need to have a plan for a crisis. If as we keep saying, when the cyber breach occurs, because it's a matter of when. So I'll at that point here.
Yeah, and there's a common theme I see through the guiding principles that have been coming out. Now, all our guiding principles are built from the ground up with people's experiences and bringing their best practices together. So, we know that these aren't just things we're putting out there to say you should do this. This is from people who actually have to deal with this. I think the people you had involved in this council are quite impressive. But a common theme I see across these guiding principles that are coming out of the DCRO is this notion of boards attesting or boards making statements that they are handling these things. And I'm glad you mentioned that, and I'm glad that's included here. As soon as you sign your name to something, you know it's important, and you know you want to have it be right. So I was glad to see that there. So another thing that we try to do with all these guiding principles is to make sure they're practical. We don't want somebody to pick up these documents and say, well, that's nice, it's fluffy, it doesn't do much for me other than give me some talking points. We're really trying to get stuff that boards can put into action. Pick this up, start your work on this particular issue. And this third guiding principle starts to talk about that. But I think the 3 lines of defense is something that most risk people are familiar with. But either of you, David, maybe do you want to expand on what you mean by having these 3 lines of defense around cybersecurity?
Sure. So level 1 is generally risk identification and assessment. Usually goes with the business line itself and with the technology area. Level 2 is oversight, strategic oversight, constructive challenge, and integration into operational enterprise risk. And level 3 is usually the audit side, which provides some sort of assurance. So with cybersecurity, you want to see 3 lines of defense. Now, it gets very fuzzy, and this is relatively new because you can go to a lot of risk management CROs and departments, and where they, what their responsibilities are for cyber is fuzzy. So we thought it would be very important to sort of enumerate, what they should be focusing on, which again is the, oversight and constructive challenge and the integration with operational and enterprise risk. I mean, this brings another issue that people talk about, like CISOs, Chief Information and Security Officers. Where should they report? Now, I've seen surveys where maybe 65% report to the CTO, 20 to 25% report to the COO, 5 to 10% report to the CRO. And people say, well, I mean, if the CISO reports to the CTO, that's a conflict, right? So how do you govern that? What are the issues surrounding that? One might be to have a Security Information Committee. But the point here is that you want to manage it within 3 lines of defense and somehow or another bring it together so that you can avoid conflicts and everybody's on the same page. It's interesting that we talk about intelligence-driven strategies, and I have to thank Kevin Brock, who was on the committee and who actually created the FBI's counterintelligence unit after the 9/11 attacks. And he, the perspective there is that he brought was, hey, look, you got to be proactive as opposed to reactive, okay? And you got to be out there anticipating and understanding what's coming at you so that you can get ahead of it. And we thought that was a very important point, and we wanted to put it into the principles, and you see it here.
And Kevin was at the FBI, right, David?
Yes.
Is that where he was doing that work? And I think that's an example, again, of the kind of people you brought into this initiative. So there's an incredible amount of thoughtful guidance here. So this last 3B is along the lines of resiliency, I think, is what we're getting at. So you're constantly adapting, but you're constantly gathering information. So it's not all reaction. Some of it's anticipating to the extent that you can. So, Roel, you had talked about opening windows, or windows that were open, I should say. And I think this 4th guiding principle talks about, where many and many of the windows are open within organizations, and that's working with third parties. they can both attenuate risks and exacerbate risks. So can you talk just a little bit here about why third-party vendor relationships rose to the level of a full guiding principle, and as opposed to just a bullet point somewhere?
Yeah, we thought a lot about it, and really the major reason is that so much of cybersecurity today is based on outside contractors providing, the software, providing data, that may be purchased, that may be used. So you have all of these. Again, maybe I'm a guy for metaphors, but you have all of these pipes coming into the company, essentially, right? And it's not whether it's almost a necessity, because most companies are not large enough to be able to have all of these capabilities in-house. So you have to bring in a McAfee, you have to bring in a particular consulting group or some other group, like one I just spoke to recently, is creating virtual desktops for a company, right? Just to add another layer of defense. And so all of these contact points end up being very critical and bring in all these other exposure points. And so you multiply them. If you're doing it mathematically, you're just multiplying the combinations of the places where things can go wrong. So it becomes another management issue, right? Going back to our basic theme, subcontractors have to show the responsible parties in management that manage the subcontractors that they have their own programs and that they have their own systems for preventing hacking and preventing breaches, and so that has to be done, and because so many, just once again, so many incidents have occurred through third parties, we felt that it merited, its own separate principle, and likely, in the future, if not half, a substantial portion of cyber breaches will be through third-party vendors. So anyway, it's very important that this be managed, that this be elevated, that there be, depending on the number and the importance, that there be very specific individuals within a company accountable, and the boards themselves need to be asking questions, again, about third-party vendors, which is why we elevated it to a principle.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's so easy for us to just take for granted what's going on within our organizations that we forget the vast majority of it is being provided to us by people outside of the organization, and that's just how the internet and our economies work. So it's important, I think, that you did raise it to that level of a guiding principle. So let's get to this last point here, which is on culture. We talk about risk culture, we talk about corporate culture, and sometimes it's a very squishy subject and we can't really put a handle on it. But you guys have tried to suggest to people how that culture is communicated. Do either or both of you want to talk about this? Does it relate to the duty of care of boards, legal liability for directors? What's the main guidance around culture as well as the motivation for it?
So let me give you my perspective quickly. I always believe that cultures don't change quickly, they migrate. And if you think about cybersecurity, that changes quickly. So you have a conflict. And a lot of times, with cybersecurity, in terms of culture, we focus on the environment. We talk about the security of the networks, the servers, the applications. And basically, it becomes an end into itself. And we don't think about the data. So we need to change the culture to start thinking about, hey, what is it important that we're trying to protect? I mean, I was blown away. I know Allianz Ireland got users to rate the sensitivity of data, and in a few months, there was a 58% increase in employee awareness and a 89% reduction of breaches. But the idea here is that what's important to protect, and how do we get the employees, involved in this by training them, by showing the importance of it, by placing strict adherence on it. All of these things are important to changing the culture that changes slowly against the fast-paced changing cyber environment?
Those are great points, David. When I was an SEC commissioner, I served immediately in the aftermath of the Enron scandal, WorldCom, and those. And I joke around that in those days frauds were straightforward. People just invented numbers, in terms of their financial statements. What we were.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh at that, but I remember those days.
Sadly. But, so one of our missions became, how do we change, the culture of integrity, and why isn't it already there, right? So these were substantial questions and puzzling questions, in particular, particularly involving large companies that you would think would be better at this. So we began, and I think today it's it's pretty well standard lore for boards and others. And that, integrity begins at the top, right? Fixing the tone at the top is everything, right? If you have, in my boards, I make sure, and I raise it if it isn't, that the CEO's picture, with some statement saying, we do everything honestly here, if you're not sure, ask about it, Anyway, these kinds of things need to be littered all over the workplace, in the bulletin boards and others, reminding folks of their duty to be honest and support integrity. So cyber, is one of those things that needs to begin at the top. And the board and the senior management team are the top. And so you need the similar types of statements to essentially ingrain into employees, and it's going to take a while, as David was saying, in some cases, that keeping the integrity of the workplace in terms of keeping it from being hacked, keeping it from being disclosed or thievery occurring, in terms of important data, that's every individual's responsibility. It's not okay to bring a thumb drive in, for example, and put it on to your desktop. It's not okay, not to have your security items and protections on when you remotely access the network. So they seem simple and straightforward, but so many problems arise from that. And so again, it takes a concerted effort. I believe in training. I know David does, where you remind employees, you make it mandatory that they take some training, in terms of things having to do with phishing, suspicious emails coming through. All of these items are actually, responsible for a huge majority of the successful cyber attacks. And employees just need to be reminded over and over, right? I mean, everyone has a family life, everyone has interests outside of work, everyone isn't always totally focused. And this is why this culture has to be developed. It is ultimately the best shield is if people, down to individual employees at all levels, understand that it's their duty to protect the company in this way.
And let me just quickly comment on that one point, if I can. When you talk about shield, I think about what's the best protective system out there? It's probably the human body's immune system, and there's three functions: sound the alarm, solve the problem, and recover and remember. Right? You have these white blood cells that perform that. But if you think about culture and you think about employees, they have to, they're the first line of defense. They have to sound the alarm. The problem needs to be solved, and then we have to recover and remember. So it just goes back to Roel's point about how important the tone at the top is and how important it is to get the employees involved in it.
And I think, David, just to echo some of what you guys were saying earlier, is that we have to understand no matter how good all of our systems are, they will eventually be compromised. There are just people always innovating ways to compromise the systems, and so the preparedness in terms of how you respond is also essential. And I think that was some of what you were trying to say there with how the body remembers things. So this is really helpful. I want to just quickly make sure everyone has the contact information for David and Roel. So that's on your screen right now. This is a big thing. This is a lot of work. Board duties, the responsibilities of a board member are growing, and I think that if there ever were days that you could phone it in, those are certainly gone. And this is just one area in which there's greater responsibility under the definition of care and the duty of care that board members have. So you guys had a great group together on this. I know that you both said you'd be happy to answer questions from people, and so the email addresses are on your screen. So feel free to contact Roel and David, whether you're just looking at getting started, if you've got questions about what you're doing. They can also connect you with some of the people who are part of the Governance Council. If you haven't downloaded this document yet, on the same screen is the website for the DCRO. It's dcro.org. Just click up on the menu that says Guiding Principles. All of the guiding principles that we publish will be up there, so you can download the Qualified Risk Director Guidelines or Compensation Committee Guidelines. Later this year, the Risk Committee Guiding Principles will be up there, and as I mentioned, we'll start a project on innovation governance. All of this stuff is designed to help boards be better at taking risk and organizations better at taking risk, which means better at pursuing what their objectives are. And again, this is all people from the industry contributing their experiences, and I'm very appreciative, David and Roel, of the time that you and this Governance Council put in. I know it's a big commitment, and so I hope it's been valuable for you. Any questions that people have, please contact David and Roel, or if you've got information or questions you have about the DCRO, you can use the email address on there. And I'll thank you for being a part of today's conversation. Thank you, David and Roel.
Thank you. Our pleasure.
Thank you.